Hello everybody, welcome to this video. This video is based on the new series that will run until Godzilla King of the Monsters in 2019. In this video it's going to be the beginning video, and this is a controversial video because it could be possible, it could not be possible, we don't know. Are the skull crawlers related to King Ghidorah or Rodan? So now on YouTube, a lot of YouTubers out there so far have been discussing whether or not the skull crawlers are related to King Ghidorah or Rodan, and that's very difficult because the skull crawlers kind of look like, well, both of them. So how do you sort of, and I'm about to give my opinions in this video on how it's possible and how it's not possible. So half of this video is going to be based on King Ghidorah, and then the other half is based on Rodan. So we'll talk about Rodan first, since he seems to be less popular than King Ghidorah. So the possibilities of the skull crawlers being related to Rodan. It's very likely, because the skull crawlers, they kind of look like Rodan in the face, because they kind of have that weird beak looking thing, and it can be possible, because as well as that, their arms are really long, and the reason could be because they have wings, maybe. I mean, that's kind of, it's probably not true, they probably don't have wings or anything. But as well as that though, the skull crawlers, they only kind of look like Rodan due to the face, and their face kind of looks like a beak, in a way, like a bird beak, or Rodan's beak, or a pterosaur beak. But we have to understand that Rodan is indeed sort of a mutated pteranodon, at least in the old continuity, in the Monsterverse, in the new, brand new the Monsterverse. It's possible that Rodan is kind of related to the skull crawlers. I don't really think that's likely, because they both seem to be different entities within the Monsterverse. And the only thing that's shared between them is the face. So it's not many people understand the possibilities of it. It could be, I may be very wrong. Here's an example, because this was an original concept of Rodan for the Monsterverse, and as you can see here, his face kind of does look like a skull crawler's. So maybe there's an ancestral trait, because we've always said, we've now heard from a lot of from Godzilla 2014 and Kong Skull Island that these are ancient species that lived before man. So it's possible that maybe the skull crawlers are sort of a modern ancestor to Rodan, or the Rodan species. So Rodan's been around longer than the skull crawlers, but the skull crawlers are sort of related ancestrally by Rodan. That's why they look so similar, because millions of years ago they may have divided in evolution, or they may have done completely something else. They may not even be related, but I'm just saying, as a theory, maybe like skull crawlers and Rodan species, they divided millions of years ago before the dawn of man, and then as man started to colonize each and every continent, the skull crawlers have started to adapt and evolve, and no longer are there like Rodans around that can fly, but now there are skull crawlers, which are the sort of second versions of Rodan, or the Rodan species. And ever since humans started to colonize the planet, the skull crawler species have been adapting. They've learned to go underground, and they've lost their power around the planet, and then started living around Skull Island. Now there is this new comic coming out, which is before the movie Kong Skull Island, and it's talking about the ancient battles between Kong's species and the skull crawlers. So maybe then the skull crawlers are a modern ancestor, so because Kong had to be related to apes to be evolved, and they've started, humans have been evolving for about 10, 30,000, something thousand years, but that's very close to us, the 21st century. which is 2017 currently, so the 21st century. So it's very, you know, the Skullcrawlers would have to evolve during that same time too, in order to then beat the competition. So in that case, the Skullcrawlers have adapted their traits to sort of fight off the Kong species on Skull Island. So, you know, maybe there was rodans, but because of the ever-growing population of Kong or Kong species, the Skullcrawlers had to adapt to that, and no longer were they able to fly, but now they're two-legged you know, they're more built for running and fast maneuvering and fast hunting. So no longer do they hunt in the air, although that would have been a better adaptive trait, but, you know. And yeah, so in that case, the Skullcrawlers would have to have recently evolved from Rodan, and that means Rodan would have to be more recent than, for example, when Godzilla was around, because Godzilla, the 2014 Godzilla, it's been stated in the Godzilla Awakening comic, but, you know, not many people say it's relative to 2014 because it's got a lot of plot holes. But, you know, Godzilla's species have been thriving Earth since the Permian period, which is millions of years old. So that's further away from us than the Skullcrawlers would have to evolve. So that's the issue. If the Skullcrawlers would have to evolve from Rodan, then Rodan would have to be closer to us than closer to Godzilla. Because Godzilla's been around for millions of years now, judging by the Awakening continuity. So in that case, then Rodan is a closer relative to the Skullcrawlers. Or Rodan and the Skullcrawlers are related, and the Skullcrawlers are a hive mind. So if you think about bees, they have a queen bee, which in this case could be Rodan, and then the Skullcrawlers are the working bees, the workers. So that's probably why they look so different, because if you find a queen bee, they don't look the same as the worker bees, especially when all the worker bees are male. So in this case, could Rodan be female? Maybe. But let's get back to the main topic about if Rodan is related to the Skullcrawlers. And again, like I said earlier in this video, it's probably likely that Rodan is related to the Skullcrawlers. Here's an image right now of a Skullcrawler. So the head, as you can see here right now, looks like a beak, which then could be relative to Rodan. The arms are very long, which could also then again be related to Rodan, because in the Toho series and the Showa series, Rodan's arms have always been long and they kind of look human-like, mainly because of the suits and all that. So, you know, maybe these arms that the Skullcrawlers have are sort of an evolved or an adapted version of Rodan's wings. And then the leg, the giant tail, basically, that could also be, you know, because they're being closer to the ground, they need to be more faster. Rodan would have to be lighter. So without legs, he could probably run faster, which goes to the Skullcrawlers. So that kind of makes sense if Rodan is related to the Skullcrawlers. But again, nobody really knows, because it's kind of, you know, continuity, and it's controversial at this point of time. But otherwise, could Rodan be related to the Skullcrawlers? It's very much likely. It's not impossible. It could be likely, but at this point we don't know. So yeah. Now, in our next segment, we're now going to discuss if King Ghidorah is related to the Skullcrawlers. And backtracking from what I said earlier, saying that Rodan's probably more likely. Now that's probably true, because King Ghidorah looks very, 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 I'm going to say this one more time, very different to the Skullcrawlers. It's very hard to see King Ghidorah in the Skullcrawlers, but it could be possible, because if we look at the body, you know, it kind of has a build of a King Ghidorah. And you may be like, what the hell are you saying, Daniel? You're probably wrong. It doesn't have wings, it doesn't have a long neck, and it doesn't have 3 heads, and it doesn't have 2 tails. So, if I go back to the sort of ancestral evolution thing, you know, King Ghidorah probably lived before, well, during the beginnings of man, which explains Kong species, and then due to adapting to the Kong species, or to larger things, such as the return of Godzilla during that time, because Godzilla may have risen from his slumber at that time. You know, King Ghidorah would have to get smaller and smaller and adapt to the Kong species, and you know, its 3 heads are pretty much useless, like, in a way, and flying is again useless somehow, and 2 tails are also useless, and its arms adapted to legs. No, its arms adapted to its wings adapted to arms, and then its legs kind of shrunk. So, in this case, the Skullcrawlers can only be related very thinly. There is no real evidence or, you know, showing that, you know, it's very unlikely to think that the Skullcrawlers are related to King Ghidorah, because King Ghidorah looks very, very different. For example, the Skullcrawlers are grey with like white on the face and stripes. King Ghidorah is gold, or yellow, or a sort of really pale orangey colour, depending. So how could the Skullcrawlers be related to King Ghidorah? And as well as that, King Ghidorah is kind of an alien to Earth, so in that case, how is that related to the Skullcrawlers? Because the Skullcrawlers have been stated that they're ancient species who have thrived here for years and years and years, so it's very hard to see how this is logical, or how this is happening, how this would happen. But in a you know, speculative evolutionary theory, the Skullcrawlers evolved during the time of the apes and man developing, so King Ghidorah's species would have to evolve and get smaller and divide its 3 heads and somehow lose its 2 legs, its wings, its 3 heads, its 2 tails, and turn into a Skullcrawler. But guys, it's very, very controversial. It's very difficult to analyze how King Ghidorah could be related to the Skullcrawlers, but it is a theory stated by many YouTubers that King Ghidorah could be related somehow to the Skullcrawlers. Maybe, again, like the hive mind thing I stated earlier with Rodan, maybe King Ghidorah is the hive mind of the Skullcrawlers, like bees. So in my next video I will be talking about how ancient are the Monsterverse kaiju. So, as I said earlier, you know, so basically in the next video we'll talk about how ancient the Monsterverse kaiju are. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.